Jimbo Paris, and you are listening to The Jimbo Paris Show. All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to The Jimbo Paris Show. Today we have John Cole. He is the host of Art Talk, and he's also focused on 3D animation, and he was also a part of the United States Coast Guard. So he definitely has a lot going on for him. He's definitely a man who has experienced quite a bit. And I would like to know a bit more about him. So yeah, how's it going, man?
Very well, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on the show. I've been looking forward to this now for quite some time.
Yeah, it's really a privilege. And I'm noticing that grandfather clock you have behind you looks very nice.
Thank you. Yeah. I've got quite a little office set up here. This is pretty much what I would call my creative suite.
Mm.
Not to be confused with Adobe or anything like that, but it's basically my podcasting location, my art space, and really a very good representation of who I am.
Mm. Okay. Now, when we talk about who you are as a person, can you give me a bit of a gist about what is John?
Right. Well, that's a really good question, and that's something, believe it or not, I've been struggling with over the last few years. I grew up in the Buffalo, New York area in what I would call a very poor environment. My father, who was a World War II veteran, never really had much of an education, so we spent most of our childhood moving from place to place so that he could find, work. So he did everything from working in orchards, picking apples, to working at carnivals that would go from town to town. And some of the stories he used to tell us it was just crazy, right? So that was really my upbringing, and the issues that I had during a child really were something that prompted me to join the military right after high school. I was one of those folks, like I'm sure there's many of, who didn't really care for the social dynamics of high school. So I was really looking forward to graduating and getting my life started. But I joined the Coast Guard in 1984 when I was 19 years old. And for 35 years, I spent active duty, providing service to the American public through search and rescue, law enforcement, and things like that. And then I was told I needed to retire in 2020, and I hadn't planned on retiring at that point. So that was a bit of a surprise to me. But like any organization, the Coast Guard does have certain thresholds. And if you don't meet the minimum threshold, well, they let you go. And I was okay with that. But that started this new journey in my life, right? It's that old, what am I going to be when I grow up type thing, because I was so used to being an active duty service member. So I struggled for a little bit and ended up finding a coach, Allison Roberts. I'm sure you know that name because she was on your show maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. But I've been working with her for the last 3 years, and I'm kind of coming into my own finally with her help, looking at who John is. And I'm finding that I'm a very creative person. So my talents have been shifting towards the creative side. And you mentioned a couple of the things, the 3D animation, I also do oil painting, pet portraits, and I'm really discovering who I am. And it's been very, very exciting.
Hmm. Why did you become a Coast Guard? And again, thank you for your service. That was definitely a very long time. And I'm just curious, what would sort of motivate you to join the Coast Guard?
I've thought about that as well. My decision to join the Coast Guard back in 1984, well, part of it was because I really needed to escape this relationship issue I was having with my father, right? And it just so happens I got married to my high school sweetheart that final year. Actually, it was the year after high school. So we had both started going to school. I was going to school for computer information technology type courses. And then we found ourselves pregnant, and that changed that dynamic. So believe it or not, Jimbo, I picked the Coast Guard because we looked in the yellow pages. So it wasn't necessarily that I had a huge passion to join the service. Rather, it was I was living in Buffalo, New York at the time, and in the 80s, it wasn't exactly the city with a lot of opportunity. Now that's changed a lot since then. Buffalo now has really become a very good city to live and work in, but at the time it wasn't that great. So we looked in the yellow pages. I thought, hey, the Coast Guard sounds kind of neat. And we went down to the recruiting office, and next thing you know, 35 years went by. So that was my genesis for why the service. But it turned out to be probably the most exciting thing I've ever done in my life.
Now, when we talk about the most exciting thing you've done your entire life, and then you mentioned postcard, what were some of the biggest lessons you took away from that that may have, in an odd way, helped you become sort of this Amazon best-selling author and sort of this guy that does so much interesting things with art?
Well, I think that the major lessons, looking across that 35 years, I think, and again, these are positives and negatives. It really depends on how you look at it, right? In any military organization, it's very structured. So one of the things I walked away with was the ability to be able to focus on the tasks that need to be done. Now, that's a really good thing, right? Because you're able to meet schedules, you're able to do the things that people ask. But on the flip side of that, sometimes you can be too structured. So when you're in situations that might be a little more spontaneous, for folks like myself, it's a little more difficult to shift your focus, which again is where the coaching program has been so beneficial to me because, by being guided or given the tools to step back a little bit to look at my behavior in a Coast Guard mindset and recognizing that, I'm able to say, well, I am leaning a little bit too much towards the structure and far less towards the spontaneity piece. So, as I move forward, I'm able then to blend the two, which is really good, right? I do run my own podcast, and being able to have the discipline to get it configured, to find the guests, to actually sit down at 5 p.m. Eastern time every Tuesday night to do it. That's Coast Guard leaning. But since I do my broadcast live, I now lean towards the spontaneity piece, right? Because I never know what's going to come out of my mouth, right? I never know how the conversation is going to go. So the blend of the two has been fantastic. So the lesson there was the discipline piece. But I mean, I could go on and on. I think even the ability to meet people and learn about them, it was also a great lesson I brought. The Buffalo area in the 80s was, I guess I would describe it, probably a little more racially segregated than it needed to be at the time. So when you're in that environment, you might walk away with certain biases and things like that. But the benefit of joining the service and, wearing the uniform, because the beauty of any uniform is that it strips, religious backgrounds, racial backgrounds, economic backgrounds, and it teaches you this level of respect that I think is very rare in other, business cultures. So for me, that was another thing I walked away with, is I walked away with a better appreciation of people, which was a terrific lesson to learn.
That's quite interesting.
Mhm,
And you mentioned a lot this idea of structure.
mhm.
When I think of an artist, I generally think of this crazy, spontaneous person with lots of, that's able to think in many different angles.
Right.
But you sort of came out of a very structured environment into art. So I'm thinking here, was the artist always there when you were in the Coast Guard? Was this a new shift? Like, how did that change happen going into this 3D animation, everything else?
The artist piece of me was always there. He
Mhm.
was hidden, right? I think it was my last 2 years of high school, I took some art classes, and I enjoyed it. As a matter of fact, at one point, I had considered going to university for art studies, right? But because my life took this unexpected turn with me getting married and having a child at such a young age, and then, of course, living in a rather depressed area, I really felt that I had no alternative but to seek some kind of financial support, and the Coast Guard just was that fit, right? But for those 3 decades of service, I tried to insert art in various places, right? Whether or not it was designing a newsletter or, designing flyers or things like that for, social events. At least I kept a little bit, maybe a finger on the art world. So it was always there. And I think that with me retiring and then having the opportunity to really start exploring who I am, it really gave me that flexibility then to focus on that. So that's really how I got from point A to point B.
Were there any influential artists that may have personally guided you towards this route? Are there any artists that, because I know there's certain artists that may try to replicate others or maybe that's what they do. They take different styles and they create their own styles. Like, well, what is your style of art? And were there any people that sort of motivated that?
Well, I think it depends on which art we're talking about. If we're looking at like my oil paintings or my acrylic paintings or things like that, I lean towards the realistic side. For me, coming from such a structured background, it just seems to be something that I prefer over things like abstract or, freely painting whatever decides to come out at the time, right? So I lean towards the realistic. So when you're looking at some of my, animal portraits, or you look at some of my landscapes or something like that, I really try to put in as much detail as I can. Now, on the animation side, that's completely different, right? Because there is this ability now to create 3D elements or things that appear 3D. You're now able to look at things from all sides. And although there is a element of realism there because you're basically building things, right? When I'm doing that type of work, that's when my writing brain takes over, my fantasy brain takes over. So it's a slightly different perspective on that. Now, as far as people that influenced me, I would say that really Pixar in general. I think at a point Pixar had broken off from Disney. I think they're reintegrated now. But at the time I was living in the Bay Area, and in Emeryville is where the Pixar studios are. And I remember driving by there when we were going to, I think it was the grocery store, or maybe one store down that way, and we would pass by, and I kept thinking, man, it would be so cool to work there, right? So someday that would be my goal, right? Is to work in this studio. But in the meantime, I've got the capability and the technical expertise to be able to do this at home. So for the time being, it's just a matter of generating my own stories and then rendering out my own stories. But Pixar for me would be on the animation side. For the painting side, I think you could probably take a look at any of the old masters. I think that they've been very influential just in what they were able to do with the supplies that they had at the time.
Now you talk about supplies here
Mhm.
and sort of, 3D animation as a whole. I think a lot of people, we might be familiar with 2D animation and
Right.
maybe those types of things, but how does 3D animation work? What tools do you use? And are there any struggles or benefits to 3D animation versus maybe 2D?
I'm glad you brought that up. Tools wise for animation, let's say if you wanted to do it right now, Jimbo, right? You have your computer online. I don't know if you're running a Mac or whether or not you're running a Windows machine, but regardless, there are software tools that you can download to be able to create these 3D environments, right? So you ask yourself, well, what's my budget? Well, the sky's the limit. Well, if that's the case, you can buy some very high end software to produce 3D animation. If you're somebody like me that says, well, yeah, I would love to have this $1,000 product, but I'm kind of on a budget. There's software like Blender. Blender is an open source software that is really as good as some of the higher end, not all the higher end, right? If you're going to work for Pixar, you're going to get a proprietary set of software to use, which is not something that's necessarily open to the public. But there are programs like Maya, which is Autodesk. They put out Maya, which has a cost, right? It's a subscription just like Adobe and some of the other products. But for me, wanting to keep on the low side, Blender works perfectly well. It runs on Mac, it runs on OS, and it really allows you to create these animated worlds. In that particular discipline really consists of objects, people, and an environment. And all of that is controllable within this 3D application. Is it complex? Because that's a question that I've had people ask me before. Is it difficult? It's really no difficult than learning anything else, driving a car, playing the piano, doing your own podcast. It's a matter of just starting with the basics and then building on that. But it can be very complicated. It can be very complicated. The only issue that I've seen with any of these 3D applications is the render ability of your personal computer, right? How fast is your computer? How much memory does it have? I have found that and I'm running I think it's a 2021 iMac. So it's got the M1 chip, it's got the latest operating system on it, and everything is up to date. But I find that if I want to render, let's say, a 10-second animated clip through Blender or Maya or any of these 3D apps, it probably takes close to 30 to 40 minutes just to render 10 seconds of video. So what ends up happening, I think, is that the limiting factor is how powerful your computer is. But other than that, the sky's the limit. If you're patient and you build out your scene and you love the way it looks and you hit that render button and you don't mind, going to sleep and then coming back in the morning to take a look at your results, then there's not an issue. But if you're in a hurry, I'm not exactly sure if that would be your cup of tea.
Hmm.
Yeah.
How did you build a solid art business and begin to develop a foundation as an artist? Because I think sometimes there is this connotation that artists, tend to strike lucky at times, but they're very creative, but they tend to sometimes struggle on the financial end of things, or sometimes they do really well, but they're a part of the only, the select few.
Art is a risky business. I'm not going to lie about that. And I think that if you go into any sort of creative business lane, well, what I think you have to understand is that there's only ever been one Picasso, there's only ever been one Leonardo. So to even assume that you're going to be the next one might not be the best place to put your effort, right? But on the other hand, doing and starting to build a business in art for the sake of the pure joy of doing it, and knowing that what it is that you do, you're having fun while you're doing it, that really serves for me as the foundation of what it is that I'm attempting to do. So the podcast, for example, I had a lot of fear around starting my own podcast because, as you know, there are hundreds of thousands of competitors out there, right? Whether or not it's with your type of format or whether or not it's with my type of format, speaking about art. I mean, you name it, it seems to have been done. And I think the challenge is we often get very intimidated by that, and then we might not do it. And that's really just that fear response, right? The fact is that we are all unique and we all have this voice and we all have something to say. So whether or not that's in an artistic format on a canvas or whether or not that's in a podcast format like what you're doing, we have to keep in mind that we're providing value there. And it's really not a competitive thing. Okay. Yes, you might not grow rich off of it and you might not be that next Picasso. However, there really is more to what we do as artists than that. It's the creative flow process. It's that look in people's eyes when they see the work that you've done, that that they appreciate what it is that you're doing. So for me, that really serves as that foundation. The podcast itself, yeah, I struggled with that, like I said in the beginning, on what I was going to talk about. And I basically settled on speaking to art because, again, it's the fact that I firmly believe that we all have a creative side, but we're just afraid to pursue it. So my hope with mine, when people watch these episodes that I produce, is just to say, you know what, this gal here, I reflect in her, right? She resonates with me and I've never tried it. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up a paintbrush, or I'm going to go ahead and download a 3D application, or I might even look up what AI is just so I could learn more about it, right? So the intention there is really to instruct, train, and educate.
Now, you started to allude to this, but I want you to kind of go more in depth on it. Why did you start, Art Talk? What is sort of the value of Art Talk? And is this sort of a part of your overall business strategy?
It is. If you look at it from a business perspective, building a brand is not necessarily easy. For somebody like me that spent so long doing, military type work, to walk out of that and then all of a sudden have this brand of who John Cole is, it could take a little time to figure that out. Because again, whether or not it's art or something that you've done, 30 years ago, or whether or not it's something brand new, that does take a little bit of time to get you from point A to point B. So the Art Talk portion really was fallout from me trying to identify where my passions lie, and really what I was passionate about and still am is not only the creative side of the doing of the art, the painting, the 3D animation, but also the fact that I love talking to people. Interestingly, and I think a lot of folks can probably resonate with a lot of folks who have a while in a particular career. When you change careers, when you go from military into civilian life, or you go from, working at General Electric to some other job, or, Jimbo, you've spent, 20 years doing a podcast, and then tomorrow you decide for whatever reason you're not going to do it anymore. When you make that transition, one of the biggest things that we tend to lose is the sense of community. For 30 years, I had friends. And what's interesting about any uniformed organization is that wherever I went in the Coast Guard, there was always somebody there that I knew. The Coast Guard itself is only 40,000 active duty. So the odds of me running into somebody that I knew every time I would move across country or to Hawaii or down to West Virginia, I was stationed in West Virginia for a while, I knew someone there. And because we all wore the same uniform, there's already something that we have in common. So for me, community was very, very important. And when I stepped away from that, they continued on. Well, I felt as if I got left behind, right? Those communication channels just kind of went up in a puff of smoke. So with the podcast, what it allows me to do is it allows me to refresh that sense of community. And when I do it, and when I talk to these people, I walk away with the sense that, I can do this with anybody. I don't have to think that that was my community and my only community, the military. What I'm finding is that everyone is my community because we all have something to say. And when we say it, we literally can sit back and say, you know what, that resonates with me, even if it's just a little bit, and that's such a cool thing. So Art Talk, even though, again, I was scared to start it because, again, it's live and sometimes I say weird things when it's just you and I talking. It has proven to be an incredibly wonderful thing because it's helping me see that my community is everyone. It's not just them. So, that's really where that came from, was trying to rebuild a community, but finding that it's actually there and it's been there the whole time.
Now, you're also a best-selling author. How did that happen?
I started working with Allison Roberts, the cognitive behavioral expert, about 3 years ago. I had participated in one of her free, at the time it was called Painless Pivots to Power. Today she calls it Painless Pivots to Purpose. But my wife had started working with her, and I just thought I had a little bit of time today, so I sat in on her free program, and I fell in love with the idea that we have innate capability to believe whatever we want to believe and feel the way that we want to feel and really control our own lives. Like many of us, I've always grown up feeling as if I was a victim of circumstances, right? Controlled by these outside circumstances as my life progressed. Meaning, hey, I joined the military. I have to wear the uniform. I have to come in at 6 a.m. I have to leave at 3 o'clock. As a husband, I have to fill up the cars with gas. I've got to take out the garbage, right? So for me, I was living in this world of what I perceived to be control. Okay. But when I started working with Allison, what I realized was that I own all of that. I own my own decisions. You own your own decisions. You didn't have to show up for the show today. You could have said no, right? I could have easily not have clicked the StreamYard link to go live with you, but I made a choice to do so. So that small example proves that we have control of our lives. So where did the book come from? Where did the best-selling author part come from? Well, my wife signed up with Allison to write a chapter in the first Behind the Power book, which came out 3 years ago. And watching my wife go through that process and watching her grow and watching her being vulnerable to share personal parts of her story that she was afraid to talk about, but then seeing the change in her after she put the story out, people read it, and it wasn't that scary response like she thought she would receive. That gave me the courage to try it myself. So I went ahead and I talked with Allison, and she agreed to allow me to participate in her second book, which came out in 2022. And the amount of people I touched with my story, and that particular story was talking about codependency and some of the issues I've struggled with over the years with codependency, not from an alcoholic perspective, which that term tends to be associated with, but rather from my codependency on my military service, which is a real thing, right? So I wrote the chapter on that, and the feedback I received was just amazing. And that book, just like the first book, hit #1 bestseller status in multiple areas on Amazon. This year's book, because I enjoyed it so much the first year and I had more to say, I had more of my story to tell, I went ahead and I worked with Allison again this year to write another chapter for Behind the Power. And this year's story is about my struggles with perfectionism. Again, fallout from my military career and some of my experiences as a child. But I really opened myself up. This year's book, and the Kindle version is now on sale on Amazon, was pushed out on Monday morning, and it went to bestseller status right away. So we're doing extremely well. But the story, I talk about some very vulnerable stories that I hadn't talked to anybody about in the past. So that's how I got from point A to point B on the book chapter part, or the best-selling part.
Now, whether it be on this website or you just say it, how can people reach out to you? How can people know what products and services you offer? And, kind of what's the future of your business?
Right. Well, the first thing is you're on my website. It's johnrobertcole.com. I was going to use John Cole Artist, however, somebody already had the name, but johnrobertcole.com has my basic introduction to me. So as you were browsing through up here, it's got my resume, it's got some of my graphic design work, and it also has a link back to my podcast. This is, of course, like everything, a work, an ongoing endeavor. I'm constantly going back on that to tweak it a little bit, but it basically contains the gist of who I am as an artist and what I'm presently doing. Now, the future, that's a really good question. What I'm seeing at this particular point is to expand my podcasting. I've got some ideas for some secondary podcasts that I think would be an amazing route to take to allow people to tell their stories, because I think that even this short interview that we're having today only touches the tip of the iceberg about who I am and some of the things experienced over my last 50 some odd years. And the other good thing about the podcast, as you know, is it gives folks like myself that opportunity to share with people, right? So I'm thinking that's more in the future. If people want, for example, an animal portrait, there is a link up there that I can't really see. I think it's to the far right, that talks about not only the animal portraits, but also some sewing, artistic craft things that I do as well. So that would be the best way, or they can email me at johncoleartist@gmail.com. I'm also on TikTok under the same handle. I'm on Facebook under the same handle, and YouTube as well, which is where I host all my podcasts.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So I think this has been a really, really good interview, and I definitely learned a lot about you, kind of 3D animation, what you do as an artist. And just to sort of wrap this up, are there any final words, any final things you would like to let the audience know?
Well, thank you for that opportunity. I think I will say that I have struggled with fear most of my life. And I think the problem with fear is that 99.9% of the time it's fake. And what I mean by that, I'm not lessening your experience, but what I'm saying is that the fear that you think that you have 99% of the time isn't really what the problem is. In other words, if I'm afraid, for example, to start a new endeavor, to meet a new person, to start another podcast, that fear that I'm feeling is just my mind trying to keep me from changing. And this is something Allison Roberts teaches religiously, right? A lot of the fears that we have is just our mind wanting to keep us safe. But the fact of the matter is, if we understand that that's simply a resistance response, I think we would be doing more of the things that we want and experiencing a much better life for ourselves that we want. So I would challenge people just to really, when they run up against this fear curtain, to really ask themselves, why are they really afraid, right? Because doing the things that you want to do for an amazing life that I know that you want to have is within your reach. You just have to recognize that it's you that's holding yourself back. So that would be the message I would want to share.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you again, Mr. Cole. This has been a privilege. I definitely enjoyed this interview. And I just also want to say to the audience, thank you for watching. And I hope to see you next time on the Jimbo Paris Show.
Thank you.
I'm currently working on a passion project that I'm really excited about, but I need your help to bring it to life. We'll be launching soon our very own Jimbo Paris Academy. And this is going to be about aspiring creators and creating concepts. Thank you for your support. I'm sharing free bonus content to supporters. So let's make some amazing content together. our affiliate partner, LifeWork Systems, focused on helping create a better collegial environment, looking at the mental health of business workers, business employees, and overall bringing the business up. Thank you for listening to the Jimbo Parish Show.